So welcome. I'm going to share my screen and we'll do a PowerPoint here. And give you some images. If you just want to give me a thumbs up if you're seeing that nice and big on your screen. Give me a nod. Okay, wonderful. Well, wanted to do some presentations. We did this at the annual meeting, but you know, with the COVID and things, we had a little bit smaller group, and I just had so much fun doing it. I thought, well, this would be a really nice talk to do again on Zoom, and so I've done it now. This is my third time, and we talk about Mr. Hunnewell a little bit in our house tour, but he lived from 1880 to 1967. He was lived in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and he owned Belle Grove from 1929 until his death. And then upon his death, bequeathed it with 100 acres to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and they opened it as a museum in 1967. He also left funds for an endowment to help Belle Grove as a museum, as a historic site, sustain itself. The National Trust manages that endowment for us, and we have one of our own as well. And it has been absolutely essential to general operating costs. It's part of a very, very diverse, but very always paddling upstream business model that Belle Grove seems to have. So I'm eminently grateful to Mr. Hunnewell for his stewardship of the house and during his ownership. Here he is mowing the lawn. Also his foresight in donating it to be a historic site, all the work that he did. And I'll tell you all about this today in this talk. And I had other inspirations behind this. But one was that I was worried that we've lost some oral history when it comes to Mr. Hunnewell. So we had some wonderful volunteers that had connections to the Brumbach family, which I'll explain in a minute. Ellen Deaver and Mildred Brumbach especially, they knew Mr. Hunnewell, and they would talk about what he was like, what it was like to know him, what it was like for Belle Grove to be owned by him. And this was, a big part of knowing who he was and having him introduced to whether it be other volunteers or to visitors. And Mrs. Deaver passed away, and Mildred is now pretty much homebound. So we're not really hearing these stories on a regular basis. And so that was one other inspiration that I had to sort of bring him up and to share a little bit more about his history. And then as we worked on some exhibits for the new Welcome Center, we were researching the Brumbach family who built the barn, and wanted to show the transition from their ownership into Mr. Hunnewell's ownership. And so we were researching him a little bit further, and that further piqued my interest. And then I discovered in doing that research that he was actually the same age I am right now when he bought Belle Grove. So he's 49. So I thought that was kind of amazing. I think I always sort of thought he had it as a retirement home, and he did, but he was relatively young when he actually purchased it. And so we have this wonderful journal that he kept when he came to Belle Grove, and you can see there it's labeled by the dates, but then also by the visits. You can see my cursor. So all the visits that he made over the years, and he made 191 visits to Belle Grove in his ownership, which has spanned about a little over 30 years. And the first thing, this book is at Hanley Archive, where it's stored for Belle Grove. And first step was actually scanning it. So Helen Powell, she came as an intern from Shenandoah University and now works is the shop coordinator at Belle Grove. And she actually scanned quite a lot of documents that are at Hanley, including this entire journal. So that was step one, to sort of have it nearby and accessible and in the computer. And then as her COVID project, volunteer Nancy Comer actually, I gave her the challenge of actually transcribing the journal. And you can see his handwriting is not that bad, pretty legible, but still that was a pretty heavy task. And I'm really grateful that she got it done, because again, it's making this more accessible. You can keyword search it, and I'll explain a story about that in a little while. But we can learn so much about how he took care of Belle Grove, how he restored Belle Grove, by having these records fully accessible to us now. So it's wonderful. So the ownership in the 20th century of Belle Grove was Samuel Jackson Brumback bought it in 1907, and he owned it for a while, but unfortunately passed away. And then it became under the ownership of his son, J. Herbert Brumback. And he bought it in 1914, and then soon after married, built the barn that we know as the Welcome Center today in 1918, and then started having a family, and in the 1920s actually operated it as an inn. And Belle Grove, then was becoming in this brochure a bit of more of a tourist attraction, and they were capitalizing on that. And that's where Mr. Hunnewell apparently got introduced to the property, is that he came and stayed in the inn. And so here we have the first entry in the journal in 1929. June 2nd made a definite offer for Belle Grove near Middletown, Virginia. And then a couple of different entries. July 12th, he's leaving for Winchester to arrange for the purchase. So it sounds like he's going to closing. And August 2nd, he arrived at Belle Grove and unfortunately visited Mr. Brumback in the hospital because he was recovering from burns that he incurred by blasting stumps. But here, this is where it begins. And soon after, I was sort of surprised. So this is like August 2nd. August 4th, he's got the architect visiting Belle Grove. And this is not just any old architect. This is Mr. Horace Peasley. He was an influential architect and landscape architect from Washington, D.C., and he's best known for his design of the Meridian Hill Park, the Korean and Peruvian embassies in Washington, and most famously, the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial in Arlington. Very iconic. Mr. Peasley was very engaged in his private practice, but also in government service, and worked with different agencies. And so it's kind of interesting to have this sort of hybrid public-private figure, but definitely very influential. And so even as the preservation movement hadn't really begun in the 1920s, quite in the same way it did later on in the century, there was a lot of knowledge and sensitivity that was taken when Belle Grove was renovated. So here we have multiple visits while Belle Grove is under renovation in 1930. And you see that often they're staying at the Wayside Inn. So that's another local landmark and interesting just to see that the use of the inn and how often they dine there. He was often Mr. Hunnewell, and you're going to hear me keep saying Mr. Hunnewell, and that definitely comes from Mrs. Deaver and Mrs. Brumback, Ellen and Mildred. They never referred to him by anything else. And so I've really just taken up that habit as well. A sign of respect, I think. But he often would come with his sister Louisa, and both of them were not married and didn't have children, and they often traveled together. And it's interesting, I call her Louisa and I don't call her Miss Hunnewell, but that's exactly how the Brumback family referred to them. And then here we have, not even that far later, November 15th, they're moving into Belle Grove. The renovation has been complete. And this was another sort of surprise to me. I sort of in my mind sort of thought, well, it took years and years and years to do the kind of renovation that they did to Belle Grove to get it into its preserved state, because in the in the early century, it had definitely had many issues. The Brumbacks had put on a new roof, which really preserved it, but there was quite a lot to do. And during Mr. Hunnewell's time, they put in electricity. They put in hot water radiator heat under every windowsill in the manor house. They reconfigured this addition and to put in a spiral staircase. This is a kitchen here. He did put in a dumbwaiter that goes from this hallway down, like, let's see, this is the main floor, yeah. So it goes right about here, down to the lower level. And then there was a bathroom, modern bathroom put on the end of this hall as well. But in general, very little was touched. They really kept this pretty pristine, which we're very grateful to him for doing that. Very little original material taken out, if any. Only, say, a floorboard if it needed replacing. And we have other examples locally, like Long Branch and even Glen Burnie, where a modern owner, a 20th century owner, came in and more thought about designing a house to their taste rather than preserving a lot of the original material. And so just that preservation mindset that Mr. Hunnewell apparently had and Mr. Peaslee had really means that we have a lot of historic integrity to the home today. And it's something we're very proud of and very grateful to him as well. So yeah, so the renovations were completed in about 18 months, which if you've ever been through a home renovation project, it's really not bad. So one thing they did do is they did strip a lot of paint. I don't know precisely, but there must have been enough left because my predecessor did have paint analysis done. And so we do have quite a lot of information about the historic paint at Belle Grove. But you can see him here in the library with that wood stripped. And this is his favorite chair, one of his favorite spots, apparently. The Brumback children, so there were 5 children born to J. Herbert Brumback and his wife. And they lived in the addition and they continued to stay on the property, farming the property and being caretakers to the home. Mr. Hunnewell would visit several times a year, sometimes for weeks at a time, but otherwise was not there. So they continued to be his caretakers. And then when he was in residence, they would assist him with different projects. Mrs. Brumback would cook for him and clean for him in the house. So, but the little kids would, I've heard stories, they might sneak around the corner and see him in the library reading or listening to the radio and then scurry away, but they sort of admitted, they sort of he knew they were there and he was just sort of being kind. But a lot of little stories, but apparently this was one of his favorite rooms. His bedroom apparently was what we interpret as the nursery. And I thought that was kind of interesting. It's when we take someone on a house tour, we'll often talk about the nursery as the very plainest room in the house. So the woodwork is not very elaborate, that it's not as grand as some of the other rooms. But I will say it's a wonderful room. It has wonderful light all year long. It's probably one of the brightest rooms of the house. And then of course it's got the mountain views. And if you chose the gold bedroom as one's bedroom, because I'm sure all of us have had this thought from time to time, if I lived at Belle Grove, which would be my bedroom, the gold bedroom is north facing, so it can be kind of chilly. It can be a little bit darker, and it doesn't have quite those views. So I do sort of wonder if that was part of his thinking. And then apparently Louisa stayed in what we interpret as a plantation office down at the other end of the hall. Perhaps like some women, like myself, being close to the bathroom in the night, an advantage. So maybe that was one of her reasons for that choice. And good, pretty good light and the mountain views as well. So so here he is saying that he likes the effect of removing the paint. So that might be something preservation-wise that we would have maybe discussed with him if we were there, but ultimately it was fine. And this is where we did the faux graining again. So one of the really charming things about the journal is that you get to read about his day trips around the valley. So he always had access to a car, had it in a couple of different ways. He for a while, they said he garaged it in DC, and I guess he would take the train down from DC from the Boston area where he lived, and he would, drive the rest of the way to Winchester or Middletown. Apparently, at one point, there was an issue with his car, getting broken into, and so he then started garaging it in Winchester, and I guess took a bus from DC when he came. But anytime he was out for a drive, in the journal, the verb is always motored. So we motored up the valley to Massanutten and finding this plant, which is the common name is Kate's Mountain Clover, Trifolium virginicum. And this is where Nancy Comer really gets a double gold star, because there are so many Latin plant names throughout the journal that she recorded those all. So let's see. Yeah, so this love of horticulture is a big part of Mr. Hunnewell and his life and his family's life. So he's from Wellesley, Massachusetts. His middle name is Wells, and that is what Wellesley is named for, is that family. So this was part of his genealogy. This interest in horticulture and historic preservation started with his grandfather, who was Horatio Hollis Hunnewell, who lived from 1810 to 1902. He was a wealthy banker, railroad financier, philanthropist, and one of the most prominent horticulturalists in the 19th century in America. And he practiced horticulture on this estate in Wellesley for over 6 decades. These properties are still in private hands today in the family, and they've been cared for over 6 generations. So it's an arboretum. It has over 500 species and of woody plants in 53 different plant families. And the rhododendrons that his grandfather had planted in the 1850s and 1860s might be the oldest cultivated specimens in the United States. He put in one of the first topiary gardens in the United States in 1854, and they are native East white pine and Eastern arbor vitae. So this, elaborate gardens and just interest in horticulture definitely runs deep through many members of the family. We had, when we did our research on the exhibit, our volunteer Robin Young had an idea. She said, he was so involved in horticulture. He was the curator of the Harvard Botanical Society. I'll talk about that in a minute. So she thought for sure he must have a plant named for him. And sure enough, we did find one, Primula hunnewelli. It's a wildflower from the Primula family, and it was found, I believe, on the rim of the Grand Canyon, but one of the canyons out west. He was doing wildflower hunting and found this specimen and was able to prove it was different enough from other types of this plant that it was its own. And so he had that honor of having it named for him. When he died in 1964, his obituary was in the Redura, which is the Journal of the New England Botanical Club. And they stated, botany was definitely an avocation for Francis Hunnewell, and he was always careful to let it be known that he was not a trained botanist. In a way, this was pure modesty, the kind that characterized the man, for he not only knew a lot about plants, but he worked with them intelligently for nearly 60 years. He served as the I'm not saying that well at all, phanerogomic, I think, curator of the New England Botanical Club from 1918 to 1958, 40 years. His personal herbarium that he collected had more than 20,000 sheets. He collected worldwide, but the same obituary noted, quote, his most intensive collecting was done in Virginia, where he spent several months in residence nearly every year. So he actually left his herbarium collection to Virginia Tech. So that would be a really interesting avenue of study to learn more about that and his collecting. So he was a graduate of Harvard, and he went to Harvard Law and served as the comptroller of Harvard and then secretary of the Harvard Corporation, which runs the university. And he had that post from 1933 until he retired at the age of 53. So he had bought Belle Grove at 49, and by 53 he had retired. So that was his profession, but clearly an interest in nature and botany was always present in his mind. So how does that relate to Belle Grove today? You know, what insight does that give us? Well, we had a little story where all of this kind of came together this fall. This tree on the slide has since lost its leaves, but in September, we were working with a representative from the local Audubon Society on bluebird boxes that they had installed on the property. And we were doing an end of season check on the bluebird boxes to see where they were and see how they had done this first season. And we were by this tree and it was just humming, just buzzing, and almost in an eerie way. And we carefully investigated, and it really was full of bees. And it had tiny, tiny blossoms that they clearly were attracted to. But it was just kind of curious to us. You can see it's a little out of the way for where visitors usually walk. So we weren't particularly worried it was going to cause anyone any harm. But we took broke off a leaf or two and took it with us and used a plant ID app later, because it wasn't on our tree plan that the Virginia Garden Club of Virginia had done for us. It wasn't really clearly marked. So we ID'd it as a Chinese elm. So that's what a Chinese elm looks like in full leaf, and it has little blossoms. So then what do you do next is you go to the Google search. Hold on. And sure enough, this quote up here was from a gentleman who said they have this tiny elm in the backyard. It has an abundance of blossoms and tons of bees. I could almost hear the drone over the morning commute on the freeway. And this was exactly, the blossoms are very small and hardly noticeable. This was exactly our experience. We experienced the exact same thing. Just this drone of the bees, but you wouldn't even really tell that the tree had flowers on it. So one of the things that I learned when they did the internet search is that a Chinese elm can live for a very long time, sometimes almost over 50 years. So this was where the journal was so useful. That tipped us off. There's a good chance Mr. Hunnewell actually planted this tree. So we went to the keyword searching of the transcript and found that indeed he had planted Chinese elm. He started them in 1935 and he had trouble getting them going. Of the 14 that he originally had planted, only 3 survived. But later on in this entry here, this is from September 14th of 1939, he notes they're coming into blossom. And this mid-September was exactly the time that we witnessed this interesting phenomenon in this particular tree. So just even the natural history of Belle Grove is well documented in this journal. And he played a really important role in that. There's an area too of the property that's full of lilac, and that is something that we'd always heard that he planted. So I want to research this further. So the other aspect that's really sort of charming about the journal, especially as you read it over decades, is his connection to the Brumbach family. And so you do see mentions of the children by name, and this becomes especially poignant in the years of the Second World War, because Eldon Brumbach and Malcolm Brumbach served. The two of the sons served in the war, and so he's clearly keeping up with them and concerned about them. And so here we have an October 19th mention of Eldon Brumbach coming home discharged from the Army, and he had not seen him in over 4 years. There are other notes, of Malcolm home from Newport News and leaving for Pearl Harbor in 1942. And another mention that he says that he lunched with the Brumbachs at a family dinner for Eldon's wife, over 30 Brumbachs, bakers and brew bakers. So these are extended family members. And so, when children are born or get married, he always has notes of all of those things. So it's a very warm relationship that they share. And that was always conveyed to me from the Brumbach side. But it's really touching to sort of see these mentions in the diary. And then the youngest son, Clyde, who's still living today, would help him with different projects. So here's a November 3rd, 1945 entry. It said, Clyde and 3 of his schoolmates digging all day on my well and drain pipes. So the well that Belle Grove still does use was put in by Mr. Hunnewell. So when the Brumbachs had a reunion in the summer of 2019, they were seeing what we had done in the Welcome Center for many of them for the first time. I was in conversation with one of the grandsons of J. Herbert Brumbach, Jonathan Howsam, who lives in the Boston area today. And he mentioned that the Hunnewell plot is at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it's a big, beautiful, beautiful cemetery. It's an arboretum of its own. It's just beautifully cultivated and is very, very notable, has very notable people buried there. So I actually happened to be going to a wedding in Boston, but not even a month later, and made a real point to go and visit, and really glad that I did. So when you come up, there's a mound for the family, and then you go around and there's a crypt for Horatio Hollis Hunnewell, and then different family members on these different plaques on the side. So on the right-hand side here is Francis Wells Hunnewell, and then his sister Louisa underneath. And Louisa lived another 10 years after he did. It was part of the dedication when Belle Grove opened as a museum. But it meant a lot to visit this site and to consider all his contributions. And Belle Grove we wouldn't be what we are today if it hadn't been for his preservation effort and his care and his caretaking over those many decades. And then here we are at the dedication. And we just got rid of those folding chairs, I think, the last couple of years. Had some historic folding chairs as well. So yeah, so I'm happy to open it up to questions, discussion. There's always interesting questions, and you can just go ahead and unmute yourself if you want. A lot of the diaries, sometimes the entries are just as simple as the date and the temperature, and maybe nothing else. One question we had before was, did he have journals from other parts of his life? And I don't really know the answer to that. We are connected to some members of his family, but I've never talked to a member of his family that has given me that level of detail. I sort of wondered if this was a book that he kept at Belle Grove, because when guests would come to visit, they might sign their names, like you would typically keep at a rental property, a journal. but there's some entries that are kind of interesting, both in their, I'll just give you an example. It just is a range. So July 26, 1943, minimum temperature of 64, a maximum of 82 degrees. Great excitement, period. Mussolini kicked out of Italy, period. Good thunderstorms in the morning, whitewashed fence in the afternoon. So we go from world affairs to local affairs. So it's kind of charming. And then on July 27th, minimum 64 degrees, maximum 88 degrees, still whitewashing fence, which of course, any maintenance notes that the journal has touches Belle Grove staff deeply, because we're still doing that same maintenance, still whitewashing fence. July 28th, minimum 64 degrees, maximum 86 degrees, light showers during the night, fence almost half done with the aid of Mrs. Brumback and Clyde. And Louisa Hunnewell, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. So, where's Tom Sawyer coming in? And then on the 29th, minimum 67, maximum 84, more whitewashing, all inside done, shopped in Strasbourg in the afternoon.
Kristen, is there any
questions there?
Is there any evidence in the records that he might have done research on the original gardens at Belle Grove?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think, when we've tried to research the original gardens at Belle Grove, we sort of start to run out of leads. Things had changed so much. The Civil War, really destroyed the property so much in terms of just flattening out plants or fences. So I don't think we really have had much evidence of that. And then archaeologically, they've tried to discover some more, but I think that's even been challenging. So unfortunately, I don't think so. He did. He obviously was aware of the history of Belle Grove with the Height family. One of the things they would motor and do is collecting antiques. And so the core of Belle Grove's collection was from Mr. Hunnewell, from collecting antiques and their valley pieces. So that was, and also a nice gift, and to have some of those furnishings already in place.
One more question, just to backtrack a little bit. Did he ever use the Brumbacks to assist him in continuing the inn business, or was that only something that the Brumbacks did?
Yeah, my understanding was just something they did, as a way they were farming, and they and so this was probably another way to have revenue. I don't think he was interested in that at all. Though there are notes in the journal, and there's oral accounts too of Height family members coming around, tourists coming around, and any private owner of a historic home will tell you do what you can to be accommodating, but sometimes your patience gets a little tested. So, but my understanding is he did his best to be accommodating, and it was obviously very proud of the fact that of the historic significance of the home, and it's clear that some of his guests that he has are related to that, either to share the home with them or get their input.
Kristen, in the diary, is there any mention of his intention for the house after he passes? And does he say he's planning to leave it to the National Trust or anything like that?
I'll have to review those years, but Nancy reported that he states a meeting with some people that she knew, and she knew would have been connected to the National Trust. So I don't know if it says it per se, like sign the papers today. I'll double check to make sure I'm right. But clearly he's having meetings with people and getting introduced to people. So yeah.
Do we know anything about that herbarium that he gave to Tech?
I have not looked into that further yet. So I'm really curious about that.
Yeah.
And we would love to, yeah, it would be neat. It would be neat to work with a student. One mystery that I haven't figured out yet is what even got him to Virginia. Whatever got him to the Valley to begin with. His whole family life is in the Boston area. Did he have some connection, a personal connection? Did he just have a nice, pleasant trip? You know, that happens to people all the time. You go on a nice, pleasant trip and you think, this is it. This is where I want my vacation home to be. I don't. I mean, I think about it. I don't do it. Or you just had, you know, he's had several specimen hunting trips that he thought this is really great. We have had relationships with Shenandoah University, the head of their ecology department, and he has told me that he has found right around our area in Middletown, you know, on the Belle Grove property, some really amazing wildflower specimens. And he used to do wildflower hikes for us over at Fort Bowman, and there's an acre of trillium there. So I think there's obviously, we love the Valley and think it's beautiful and a great place to be. But there's probably, you know, he had a lot to collect, or perhaps this was an area that hadn't been really documented and he wanted to take that on. But I would love to work with a student or actually go down and see the collection and see if anyone was using it. Val mentioned any mention of the crash, so 1929 crash, and how that might have impacted the price for Belle Grove. I'm not sure if I don't know. So we have the only other like transactions we would have been at the turn of the century when Samuel Jackson Brimback purchased it. So it's hard to know what property values, you know, how to really measure that. But I will say, I think the timing is significant. And I think the way it's the first entry, it says made an offer. I suspect that he could see things were challenging and that this family was going to be under stress and that the financial situation in the country was under stress. And I think I sort of see it, and maybe it's just my personal interpretation, not as a historian, but that he had an ability to save this building and went for it. So I don't know if it was that he paid a rock bottom price fire sale of the property, or if he paid a decent market value for it, but he clearly was in it for the long haul because he owned it for many decades and cared for it for many decades and whitewashed the fence himself. So he, you know, it wasn't like, let's flip this property. It was, you know, this is something that's worthy of saving. And clearly all his behavior indicates that. And I think he essentially allowed the family, I mean, they worked for him and helped caretake the property, but they were integral to that. But it essentially allowed them to continue it as their home. And it was a very important home to them, and still is, and still talked a lot about the family. So Val Haddix asked that question, and then she also asked, so she's been working through the Belle Grove cookbook that the Height family, many of the Height family members had these recipes that were compiled into one family cookbook. And so she says, you know, there's a quince recipe in there. So she's wondering quince trees were there in the original Height garden. And yes, we think so. Quince and pear and apple and cherry definitely were in the orchards during the Height era. I think one of our biggest questions about the garden is how formal were the gardens during the Height era? Because we interpret it now as a kind of more of a practical garden. pleasantly designed, well maintained, but with plants there that have practical use. And so that's sort of a question is, did the Heights have more of a pleasure garden or a more practical use garden? And then exactly what was the extent of that garden and where was it? But we definitely know in the Brumback era that it extended all across the back of the yard right behind the manor house. So it was the full width of the full manor house. Any other questions or comments? I think we'd all be interested to go up.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is this transcript available?
I'm recording this. I have some notes, and I don't mind sending you the notes that I have.
I'm talking about the transcript of the diary. Excuse me. I should have been.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood you.
Yeah.
Yes, it is available. And I could send it to you. I'm not going to make it publicly available, say on our website, because of the Brumback family members that are still living, and there are some personal, not overly personal, but more than I think
Right.
Someone wants their family history on the internet.
Well, what I'm mostly interested in
but
is
I'm
whether
happy to
there's
share it with you.
reference to the Stickley farm to the south.
Oh yeah.
My brother and I own it, and so
Right.
I've been compiling history on that for a long time now, and I just want to see if he mentions, the family and interactions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to email it to you.
Okay.
Or if any of you are interested in reading it more. Yeah, but I'm just sort of just sharing it privately. It's nice. It's nice to have it in a way that you can actually keyword search. So that's what, it's lovely to read the original handwriting, but when you're actually looking for information like, wait, what tree is that? to keyword search is really neat. So that would be interesting. It'd be interesting to research more some of the people that visit. And I've met one of the family members that is written in there as having visited. We're in touch with her, but yeah, there are all little references to the local things. One thing we know is that across from 11 from Belle Grove was sort of a honky tonk bar.
I remember it.
You remember that, yeah. So and then what the CCBF headquarters was a bar too, wasn't it?
Roadhouse.
So there was like a cluster of a what?
A roadhouse.
A roadhouse, right. And was there a gas station in that stretch too?
I don't remember one.
On that side of 11?
There may have been, but I don't remember one.
Yeah, and I think there was one of the Park Service employees found an image where there's a cluster of like little cabins, like little vacation style cabins right along that stretch. But that's why the cedar trees are planted right at the entrance of Belle Grove Road. Apparently, quick growing trees that would block those lights from those businesses, because he did stay in the front bedroom. And when he looked out at night, he didn't want to see that light pollution from the businesses. So that's another note that I'd heard from Mildred Brumback. One of my favorite entries too. It is funny because it just sort of, some of these things that he mentions kind of go full circle even to things we do today. In 1955, he went into Winchester to buy Pepperidge bread. Louisa had written to Connecticut and found out that the Fairplay store, which was a grocery store chain, carried it. So he's driving all the way into Winchester to go to the one grocery store that carries the Pepperidge Farm bread. But of course, every time even Belle Grove does a tea today, it has to be the Pepperidge Farm, thinly sliced, white, always for any tea sandwich. So even today, we're still hunting down our Pepperidge bread.
Is there any reference to him using the train station that was over at Meadow Mills?
I think I don't know about Meadow Mills, but I think maybe Strasburg. I want to double check.
Well, yeah, the Strasburg train station was very active, but the route from Meadow Mills to Winchester was frequently used by the Stickley family as a for Winchester.
Yeah. yeah, looking for the train references will be very interesting too. And then even to see how that might change over time in this whole time, in his years coming out to Belle Grove. I think that's an interesting, I mean, we really take for granted quick travel, but I'm just curious, even what a trip from Boston door to door would have been for him. We don't have a Sella, you know. So yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Just thank you for your presentation. It was most interesting.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you for all the research behind it, Kristen. It sounds like a
well, yeah, no, I'm just the spokesperson, but yeah, we were lucky to have some good people behind it, and a lot more to delve into too. So people who are interested in plants, we've had a couple of garden club folks on these calls. So yeah, it's a great resource.
No, thank you very much, Kristen. We really enjoyed that.
You're welcome. Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us. And yeah, let me know if you would like a copy of this for home reading.
Thanks again.
Okay. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Thanks for coming.
Mm-hmm.